go. Okay. All right. Well, good morning. Welcome to Transform Life's first webinar in the series of transforming behaviour. Really excited to get started today talking about sensory sensitivities and how it can interact with behaviour. If I could just let everybody know that this meeting is being recorded, so please pop your mics on mute until the question time, and then we'll be able to go back and forth and ask as many questions as you want. I'm going to share my screen now, so let me get that set up. Hope everybody's doing well and feeling good, excited about finding out about sensory stuff. So I would like to start with acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land I live and work, and from where this webinar is being broadcast today. And let everybody know that, yes, again, this is being recorded but also transcribed. So if you need access to the transcriptions, you can find that on our website. So what are we talking about today? So today we are talking about what are sensory sensitivities, why do they occur, what are the sensory systems that they can occur through, what happens when sensory meets behaviour. We're then going to talk about suggested strategies, a way forward, and ask some questions. So if that sounds good, please feel free to send in your questions and we will get started. So I thought I'd give a little bit of background about who I am. So my name's Ella. I'm the Chief Clinical and Strategy Officer here at Transform Life. I've been working with autistic kids, neurodivergent families for about 10 years. And I'm excited because I think that strategies around sensory support and sensory regulation are an underutilized resource for families who might be struggling to understand the why behind specific behaviours, especially repetitive, unhelpful behaviours. There's so much that we can do to support people when it comes to sensory support and dysregulation and that kind of thing. So let's jump into it. Let's talk about the sensory systems. So lots of people think that there are 5 sensory systems. That's, I think, what we're mostly taught about in school. However, when it comes to sensory regulation and how it interacts with emotional regulation and behaviour, it's important to recognise that there are actually at least 6 that we're aware of. So we have lots of the regular ones, so auditory, visual, tactile, etc. But then we also have some of the lesser known ones that have a really big impact, especially if we do have some sensory processing disorders or dysfunctions that might be getting in the way of really good functional behaviour. Some of the ones that people are less aware of are called vestibular, proprioceptive, and interoceptive. So I'm going to go through all the ones here on screen and talk a little bit about not only what they are, but also how you can recognise those sensory systems in yourself and examples of when you might notice those sensory systems working. All right, so our most dominant and most obvious sensory system is the visual sensory system. Humans are extremely visual. We have incredible vision, and vision also takes up the most processing area in our brain. So the visual sensory system processes information from light moving into our eyes, photoreceptor cells in the front of our eyes, in the retina, convert light into signals that go through our brain, kind of transmitted through the optic nerve into the brain for interpretation. So visual processing involves things like recognizing shapes, colors, patterns, and also the relationships of things in space. So an example of when you might notice your visual sensory system working can be obviously processing light, processing motion, people moving in your environment, the speed at which things move, your eyes processing, for example, the environment rushing past you when you're in a car. Darkness, we can be very aware of when our eyes are adjusting to different light levels. And busy visual field. So when you notice that there's a lot going on in the space that your eyes are taking up, you might notice that you feel the processing is a bit more intense. So one of the things that can go wrong with the processing of visual information is called visual sensory processing disorder. So in individuals with visual sensory processing disorder, the brain can struggle to make sense of the visual information that's being processed. And that leads to challenges interpreting the visual stimuli. So that could result in difficulties with things like reading or depth perception. It might lead to difficulties with recognizing faces or sensitivities or seeking behaviors with like bright lights or busy visual environments. So the auditory system, that's obviously what we're listening to, things that are going in through our ears, and the auditory system processes sound waves captured by the ears. The cochlea in the inner ear vibrates, and that sends the neural signals to the brain that are transmitted by, again, the auditory nerve. It's all about how the information gets from the outside world into our brain. And then the brain decodes the signals into recognizable sounds and auditory experiences. Some of the things that you might recognize in yourself about your auditory processing are things like obviously sounds, but also lack of sounds, speech and how that's being interpreted, audio-visual input like from the media, and processing language. So auditory sensory processing disorder involves difficulties in processing and interpreting auditory information. And people who have that kind of sensory processing difficulty might be hypersensitive to sound, so overreacting to noises in their environment, or hyposensitive, so underreacting to sounds, and so that leads to seeking behaviours. But it also can look like difficulty filtering out background noise, and it can lead to difficulties with being able to prioritise sounds, so understanding speech when there's background noise going on, following directions, or coping with loud or sudden sounds. This is something that we see a lot with kiddos who struggle with things like the vacuum cleaner or sounds like hand dryers. That's a big one that I see. Okay, the tactile sensory system. Now, the tactile sensory system involves the skin. The skin is our biggest sensory organ, and it processes things like direct pressure, temperature, and nerve signals from the tactile receptors on the skin travel to the brain, which is where obviously they get processed to perceive touch and pressure. So when you might notice your own tactile sensory system working is when you start to notice, say, for example, the feeling of the clothing on your skin, the feeling of the sun on your skin when you might be just about to starting to get sunburnt. That's one that I get. The feeling of wind on your skin, or when someone touches you. So when somebody has tactile sensory processing disorder, it can result in either a heightened or a diminished responsivity to touch. So some people might be oversensitive to certain textures. They might be undersensitive to certain temperatures or something like that. And that can lead to discomfort or avoidance of touch. But something that we see a lot is people who have reduced sensitivity, and that means that they're seeking out extra sensory input in those areas. So that can impact things like grooming, whether they're okay with like washing themselves, wearing clothes. I see some people who do get sensitive to the feeling of socks and shoes, and that's all signs of sensory processing disorder with the tactile system. So the vestibular system, this is one of the lesser known systems that I was going to talk about. So the vestibular sensory system, so it's responsible for sensing balance, spatial orientation, where our body is in space, and movement as well. So it involves the fluid filled structures in the inner ear that detect changes in head position and movement. And so when you might notice this system really working is when you feel your center of gravity is off balance, or when you're standing right near a ledge and your center of gravity feels off kilter. So something like the ground feeling unstable, you might notice your vestibular system working. When you're dizzy or spinning around, that's when you can sense your vestibular system working. Or when you shake your head really quickly and you get that lightheaded, unstable feeling, that's your vestibular system working to bring you back to a stable center. So vestibular sensory processing disorder can lead to difficulties in maintaining balance and processing movement. So moving your body through space might become difficult. And people with vestibular SPD experience things like dizziness, unsteadiness, or difficulty coordinating movements, which, as you can imagine, affects all sorts of things: walking, playing, and sometimes in extreme situations, even sitting still. All right, we've got two more, and these ones are really big, can have a really big impact when there's sensory processing differences going on. The next one is proprioceptive. So the proprioceptive sensory system involves sensing the position of your body parts and the orientation of body parts without relying on visual input. So a good example of this is, can you close your eyes and touch your nose without missing? Then that's your proprioceptive system working. So proprioceptive receptors in joints and muscles send signals to the brain about body position and movement. So you might notice this system working when you're moving your limbs around, or you're carrying your body in space, or sometimes when we land really heavily, you can feel the proprioceptive receptors in your joints and your knees absorbing that impact. That's your proprioceptive system working. So proprioceptive sensory processing disorder can result in struggles around coordination, challenges with bodily awareness, and they might, somebody who's struggling with a sensory processing disorder with proprioceptive input might have difficulty judging the force that they're using with things, or pressure that they need to use a movement, and so that can lead to clumsiness or poor spatial awareness, and that obviously increases the risk of injury. And sometimes they can also struggle with tasks that require fine motor control, because that requires a really stable posture that can be really difficult if you have proprioceptive sensory processing struggles. So the last sensory system we're going to chat about today is the interoceptive sensory system. And this is, I think, the most interesting, but also the least known of the sensory processing systems, and that's the interoceptive system. So the interoceptive system involves perceiving internal sensations. Anything from your skin inwards that you can feel is part of your interoceptive sensory system. So perceiving internal sensations like hunger, thirst, your heartbeat, whether you're hot or cold, and also things like bowel movements. That's all sensory signals that are being sent from your body up to your brain. And it helps to understand this, because we can better tune in to understand people's bodily internal states when we have good interoceptive processing. However, interoceptive sensory processing disorder is something that I see a lot, especially with autistic kiddos, and it can lead to a lot of struggles, especially around toileting, bowel movements, constipation. So interoceptive SPNE can lead to difficulties recognizing and interpreting internal sensations. Individuals might struggle to identify hunger or thirst cues, so they might kind of eat or drink irregularly. They could also have challenges when trying to process pain or discomfort, and that will impact their ability to appropriately respond when their body is sending them those signals. So you'll be able to notice your interoceptive system working when you, for example, feel your stomach rumble. That's a sensory signal from your stomach to your brain that drives an eating behavior. But if you have a disruption to your sensory processing with your interoceptive system, your stomach might be sending your brain a message, but that message may be being scrambled along the way. It may be being disrupted in some way. And one of the ones that I see a lot is sensory information from the large intestine and the bowel. Those messaging getting scrambled between the bowel and the brain, leading to issues with bowel movements and toileting, especially in autistic people. All right. So let's talk a little bit about sensitivities specifically. I guess we're all wanting to know, okay, well, when somebody has a sensory sensitivity, how does it impact them? And then that way we can understand, okay, what's going to change about the behavior. So sensory sensitivities, which, you know, kind of using the term interchangeably with sensory processing differences, refers to a way that an individual's nervous system receives and reacts to the sensory stimuli in the environment. So as I've said, that can include sights, sounds, textures. I haven't mentioned smells, but it can definitely be sensitive to smells. And it certainly can impact neurodivergent individuals, autistic individuals differently. So imagine that your brain is sort of acting like a filter for your sensory information, right? Like all the sensory information goes in here and gets sorted out by the brain. For most people, the filter works great. It allows them to focus on what's important and also filters out less relevant sensory input. However, when you have a sensory sensitivity, the filter that's going on in the brain can be really delicate, or it can be hypersensitive, and it can cause certain sensory experiences to be much more overwhelming, much more uncomfortable, or even painful. So recognizing sensory sensitivities involves kind of observing an individual and watching how they react to a sensory stimuli. So I thought I'd mention a few common ways that you can recognize if somebody is having a sensory sensitivity, that because obviously we can't get inside someone's head. We don't know what that experience is that they're having. What we have access to is reading them, reading their body language, their face, and finding out how what that tells us about what they're experiencing with their sensory experience. So somebody who's experiencing an auditory sensitivity might do something like covering their ears, flinching in response to a loud noise, becoming really distressed or anxious in noisy environments. So as I say, the vacuum and the hand dryer, that's one of the ones that I see a lot, kids becoming distressed with that. I also had a kiddo who had a sensitivity to the birthday song, and so anytime there was a birthday song being sung at a birthday party, oh, that was a big trigger. So you can also have reaction to textures, and so that might look like refusing to wear certain clothes because of discomfort from the texture or the tags. That's a big one. Avoiding touching specific textures like sand. That can be a big one for people. Avoiding certain fabrics or the textures of certain food. The tactile processing with the mouth can be a big trigger for people. So the visual processing can be a little bit more tricky to pick up when somebody's struggling with that, but somebody might squint or cover their eyes, or become really agitated when bright or flickering lights are on. They might struggle to focus when there's a lot of visual clutter. For example, in a really busy classroom, a child who's got visual sensitivities might struggle to focus. So if a kiddo has, well, anybody has sensitivities to tastes and smells, you might notice like really strong disgust reactions to smells or tastes that we may not even notice, reacting strongly to the certain tastes of food or the textures of food. They may love crunchy food, hate soft foods, even gag if there is a soft food or a crunchy food that they are trying to eat but can't. If somebody has a sensory sensitivity to tactile, especially touch, they might avoid physical contact, such as hugging or handshakes, just due to how that makes them feel. And again, the textures or fabric against the skin. So those the differences and the unpredictability in the nature of sensory processing can cause really unfamiliar and distressing experiences if that person has internal interoceptive sensory issues. So feeling frightened when you've got something like a bowel movement can cause, continence issues, and not recognizing hunger signals from the stomach can cause, hunger that then dysregulates, right? We all get hangry, that's a thing, but recognizing if somebody's having interoceptive sensory struggles could look like those hangry cues being really exaggerated. So how do we here we go. Okay. So I guess it's important to understand that there's no way around behavior management. There's no way around the fact that behavior management needs to be relationship based, especially when it comes to understanding how sensory impacts behavior. It's so important that we reflect on our own sensory experiences because that gives us the understanding of what might be going on for someone. And because, again, we can't be inside somebody else's experience, thinking about how sensory input affects us can help us to understand how sensory input affects the ones we care about. I, for example, get extremely stressed when I'm going into supermarkets. There's something about the combination of the movement, the noise, the fluorescent lights that I find are really stressful. So I use noise cancelling headphones at all times when I'm in a supermarket, and I find that helps bring down the overwhelm. I don't put anything on the noise cancelling headphones. I just use them purely for the noise cancelling benefits. And I'm not playing any music or a podcast or anything. I just use them to bring down the sound. So I think knowing that person is the key, right? So knowing and observing your loved one's capacity tolerances for the different types of sensory input is the key to knowing how sensory inputs affect their behaviour. So there's no way around the fact that behaviour management needs to be relationship based. If you don't know the person you need to support, you'll always be on the back foot and kind of lacking understanding of what's going on for them. So everybody's sensory processing is going to impact their behaviour differently. And I think it would be remiss of me to try and create a one-size-fits-all approach to how we can support sensory and behaviour, because we have to have a full assessment of sensory sensitivities for the individual to know, okay, what's going to increase their agitation, what's going to increase their tolerance, and that kind of thing. So the best way for us to understand a specific person's behaviour is to have a full sensory assessment, work out what's going on for them. Implement a proactive sensory regulation diet, making sure that they're getting the sensory inputs that they need to be as calm as they possibly can. We want to have proactive regulatory strategies and supports on hand to, and as well as reactive co-regulatory techniques in our toolkit. So I'm going to go into the details of some kind of broad examples that might help with that, because, as I say, it has to be individualized to the person. Everybody's sensory sensitivities are different. So let's go on to suggested strategies. So there's so many different things that we might try to see if it helps somebody to tolerate their sensory inputs better. So let's start with visual. So when somebody's got visual sensitivities, they can be either seeking sensory input or avoiding sensory input, and that's the same with all of the systems. So things like providing a child with a pair of sunglasses or tinted sunglasses to reduce the bright lights and visual sensitivity. You can see I've got a picture here of a pram on the screen. Something that prams are great for, especially when they've got a fold out canopy, is reducing the visual input that's available to that child if they sort of lean right back in the pram and we pull the canopy over. They've got far less visual input to process. Something else that can really help is a sensory retreat. So designating a quiet and really visually simplified space where a child can retreat when they're feeling overwhelmed. This can be really helpful in schools and in classrooms when there's a lot going on. Having a teepee, or if possible, a little room off to the side. There can be a calming corner with low visual and auditory inputs. So we just want it to be as plain as possible and as quiet as possible. So another visual strategy can be introducing something called visual anchors. So introducing a visually simple, calming object that a child can focus and lock their visual field onto when feeling overwhelmed. That's, it might be a stuffed animal that they can really focus on looking at, taking in all the trying to block out all the external noise and visual clutter, and just looking at that one visual anchor can help ground them and just kind of, as the name suggests, anchor their sensory system. So visual dividers, that's another really good one. Using things like portable screens or panels to create temporary barriers between the child or the person and the overwhelming visual stimuli can be helpful. So tactile options. Again, a tactile anchor. So providing the child with a tactile comfort object such as a blanket or a stuffed animal that they can touch. Any kind of preferred tactile input is going to help them feel grounded and secure. Fidget tools. I know this is a popular one. This is a tactile strategy that can they can have a bunch of different types of inputs, but having a selection of fidget toys that have different tactile properties can provide an outlet for sensory exploration and self-regulation. Deep pressure is a really good tactile strategy. It's one of the ones that I find really effective for kids who need people who need regulation. So incorporating activities that provide deep pressure touch, such as wrapping a child in a weighted blanket or giving them a kind of deep pressure massage can be a good one. Vestibular supports, things like dancing and rhythmic movement, really leaning into a beat of something, engaging the person in rhythmic dancing or movement involving things like swaying or spinning or rocking to the music can be really regulating for people. I have a really good video that I send to people who need kind of rhythmic options. And it's a spoken word story of we're going on a bear hunt that just has a really heavy beat that kids and people can really kind of tune into, and it's so super regulating. I've had kids who were in full meltdown and then just starting to play them that heavy beat with the spoken word. There's no visual, so it's not overwhelming, has really helped them come down from that dysregulated moment. Swinging, such a good one. Offer swinging activities on swings that are kind of designed for sensory integration, especially like a controlled rhythmic swinging can be so super calming, and it has very good kind of organizing effects on the vestibular system and kind of reintegrating. Movement breaks are another really good suggested strategy for sensory overwhelm. I know that this is something that helps when kids or anybody needs to be seated to engage in an activity, knowing that there's a movement break coming up where they can do things like, marching on the spot, or jumping jacks, or animal crawls are going to support the vestibular system. There's lots of sensory strategies, and it's really about finding the one that works for you and for the person that you're supporting. But I hope that some of these have been helpful and given you some ideas. We're going to answer any questions now, and then after that, we will finish up. Let me just stop sharing the screen. And we can go back to another Teams meeting. So if you have any questions, now's the time to ask.
Hi, hello.
Hi.
Yes, I need to ask for something did by my daughter, if it's sensory or not. She didn't eat anything unless she smell it.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Does she smell it even when the food is familiar?
Sometimes, yes, but mostly with the new one. But sometimes she did it with the items that it's already familiar with it. But mainly with the new items, she didn't eat it unless she smell it. Then she decided eat it or not. We don't have control on that.
Yeah, that's definitely a sensory thing. I think especially if you have maybe differences in the way that you're processing the sensory sensation of food in your mouth, or you have limited ways of engaging with knowing if that food is going to feel safe, or if it's going to be unfamiliar, if it's how you're expecting or it's unexpected, then engaging as many different sensory tools as that person has in their toolkit is the best way that person can tell whether that food's going to be something that they like. So it's definitely a sensory thing, and I would say that it's also probably a lot to do with just kind of making sure that she has control over what she's eating, and feeling sure that she knows as best she can what it's going to taste like before she gives it a go. So I wouldn't be too worried that it's a negative thing or whatever. I'd say it's it's just to do with preparing herself for what that sensory experience is going to be like. I hope that's helpful. I answer lots of questions over on our Facebook page. So if you're not a member of our Facebook group, please go have a look for Transform Life AU over on Facebook and Instagram, and we can connect there. There's lots of questions and resources and those kinds of things. So thank you so much for coming. It was lovely to be able to present today, and we will be back 2 weeks, same time, same place, same link, on another topic to do with transforming behaviour. Okay, let me just see if I can stop the recording. How do I stop the recording?